All right, what's going on, guys? So today I'm chatting with Dr. Mel Davis, or I'm not sure if is your name changed?
No, I kept my name.
Oh, you did? Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about diet and behavior, something that I've been really interested in. So great to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us. Do you want to start out by
yeah,
just telling the listeners a little bit about who you are and kind of what you've been involved in?
for sure. So I work for Renaissance Periodization, which many of your listeners may have heard of. My background is in neuroscience. I did neuroscience research for about a decade. But at the time, I was also a competitive jiu-jitsu fighter grappler. So I kind of had this science and sport dichotomy for a long time. And when I finally left research in the lab and started working for RP, I was able to marry my love of science, my love of sport, and just get more and more involved in how those two work together.
That's awesome. Are you working on any projects at the moment?
Yeah, I'm actually writing a book related to the topic that we're discussing today that should be out by the end of the year.
Oh, really? That's awesome. I thought I heard you working on something, but I wasn't exactly sure when the actual release date was going to be. So that's really cool. Uh,
Yeah.
so I guess we'll just jump right into it. First question would be just to give a little bit of context, like why is there like some sort of psychological rationale for why behavior, why habits and things like that are so difficult to change?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the brain is sort of set up to make our lives easier, but the side effect of that is that in some cases it makes our life harder. So in the case of diet is a really easy example actually, where sort of physiologically hardwired to prepare for starving, right? You know, we evolved in times when we might not have food available in a refrigerator all the time. So we evolved to sort of crave these very caloric foods. So that in this day and age gets in the way of our behavior goals, where we want to lose weight, we want to look a certain way, and we get this thing that's called in the literature the intention-behaviour gap, where you want to do something really badly, but your physiology and or your habits are pushing you in the other direction. So physiology is difficult because that you can't ever really change. You just kind of have to overcome it. You're going to get food cravings when you're on a diet and things like this. There's no stopping those. And then habits are just things that ways that our brain makes our life easier. So if we can do things without thinking, like if you can imagine a life with no habits, you couldn't tie your shoe and think about something else because you wouldn't have that habitual patterned motor behavior. You'd have to think about every place that the shoelace was going. So it allows us to be super functional, but because it's such an effective brain mechanism, it can also get in the way when we don't want that particular habit to be there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've definitely struggled to change habits, and I think a lot of people do, especially when it comes to nutrition. And I guess I kind of wonder why nutrition is so much more difficult to change than something like exercise. I mean, obviously it's something you have to manage more so on like an ongoing basis versus you go to the gym, you spend an hour, and then you're pretty much good to go,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I definitely think it's that the combination of eating habits and just the physiological drive to eat is a
Yeah,
strong thing. And if you're trying to lose weight, you really have to get past that and your own brain. So body and brain fighting your brain's other intentions.
totally. So one of the things that I've always noticed as well, and I think everyone kind of hears this, if you have it in the house, you're probably going to eat it. And there's a really strong compulsion, I guess, or I shouldn't say compulsion, but like a reactive behavior when you're in different environments, when you're hanging out with certain friends, and people are always like, oh man, I was so good. But then, whenever I hang out with this person or whenever I go to this place, um, so why does that happen? And what sort of, I guess, behaviors and sort of, I guess, checks can you set in place to somewhat manage these, reactive responses?
Right. So the thing with habits, like you said, reactive is a really good word. The thing with habits is they happen without thinking, right? That's what makes them so efficient. So it's this kind of loop in your brain where you get cued by a particular context or a particular site, and the next action happens without you thinking about it. So you see the cookies in your house, and you grab one and eat it without even thinking. So it's this sort of this quick context reaction that happens, and interrupting that is really the key to changing your habits. So something like you said, getting that food, if you're on a diet, just get the food out of the house. You won't have the chance of that automatic response to the cookies happening. Or if you have particular context, like you go to a particular restaurant with a particular friend, and no matter what, you eat a whole pizza and have 10 margaritas. So maybe go with that friend to a different restaurant, just change the context, change the cues a little bit to interrupt that automatic response.
One of the things that I know you talked about, at least when I came to your presentation, I think it must be 2 years ago now, something like that.
Yeah.
When you were in Calgary, um, you talked about the cue sometimes being the main reward. Like, it's not necessarily
Right.
fulfilling the behavior, right? So I guess to make sense of that, some of the people listening, let's say you have a craving for a chocolate bar, right? If you replace that with an apple or something like that, it's more so the action that kind of creates the reward after a certain period. Is that completely off, or?
No, that's right. It's a really interesting thing that happens with habit. You start losing the need for the reward, and the action will happen even if there's no reward. So I think we've all had anecdotally the experience where we have a compulsive reaction to eat some food, and after we eat it, we're like, that wasn't even good. I didn't even like that. Why did I do that? You know? And that's the thing with
Worst
habits. They don't
feeling
the
ever.
reward goes away once that pathway is paved in your brain. So
Yeah.
replacing the compulsion with something else that's also pleasurable can be a really good way to divert habits in another direction.
Yeah, and that was something I think that I found really beneficial from your talk, and then even just from a lot of the things that I had read previously, right? Because I think a lot of the times when people approach diet, it's from the standpoint of omission. So I
Mm-hmm.
need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing that. Stop eating
Right.
chemicals, stop eating fast foods. Um, and so how would this kind of behavior, I guess, uh, be implemented as opposed to like omitting things? Like what are some of the strategies that you can do from, let's say, like a food craving standpoint,
Right.
or I guess more of a behavioral standpoint, to maybe change up some of the behaviors and be a little bit more productive?
Yeah, that brings up a really good point for a mini tangent. So something that's really interesting in behavior change is that trying to eliminate a behavior is usually less successful than trying to add a more productive behavior. So if you're just saying, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to end this, I'm not going to do this anymore, your chances of success are a little bit lower than if you say, instead of wine 7 nights a week, I'm going to have tea 6 of those nights and wine on the 7th or something like that. So replacing a behavior with something else and focusing or sort of framing the behavior change in terms of adding the new behavior rather than eliminating the old one can lead to more success for whatever reason. That just seems to be easier for people to achieve.
And to be honest, that was something that I just stumbled upon completely randomly with my own clients. I used to find that when I try and get them to maybe adopt a certain behavior, they just would struggle all the time. If I say, hey, I want you to maybe limit this or limit that, it wasn't exactly hit and miss, but I mean, it was a lot less successful than I would have liked. Whereas when I switched from that approach to, hey, I want you to eat X amount of servings of protein per day and have
Right.
like 7 servings of veggies. If you do that, you're going to be pretty damn
Hard to fit
full.
the
And
other
so
things
just
in.
automatically, yeah, you're probably not going to be able to eat as much, even if you want it, because you're just like, oh my God, I feel like I'm going to blow up. And
Yeah.
and I always thought that was a really interesting approach.
Yeah, definitely. It bears out in the psychology too. It seems to be the
Mhm.
real effect.
No, that's awesome. So you talked a little bit about food reward signaling. So what is that exactly, and what happens, like, I guess, inside the brain?
Yeah, so it's some people will have a little bit of trouble with comparing, overeating issues with addiction. And it's not quite the same as addiction, but there's definitely some parallels. So it's very much reward signaling pathways are involved. So you eat something very tasty, something high fat, high sugar, and you get reward pathway signaling in your brain, at least initially. And then your brain sort of does this efficiency thing I was talking about, where initially you might have been like, I'm hungry, there's a cookie, I'm going to eat the cookie, and it's a slow process, right? Whereas if you eat the cookie every time you see it, eventually it's like cookie eat, and there's no thought in between, and this becomes a paved pathway. And even when that reward, where maybe you weren't even hungry this time, so there's not the reward of being full after eating. Even once that's gone, that paved pathway is just so set in stone for your brains, through your brain's efficiency mechanisms, that you see the cookie, eat the cookie, even when you're not hungry or don't feel like a cookie or have a stomach ache.
Hmm. And does that change at all from a more athletic population, or let's say a leaner individuals to obese individuals? I've read I've read things, and I'm not exactly sure how accurate this is, but I've read things about obese individuals have somewhat of a diminished signal, and then their reward, well, I don't know if signal is the right word, but the reward that they actually get from it kind of goes down. So overeating is an attempt to like compensate to get that same reward
Right.
from
So
the
this
behavior.
is why a lot of people do compare overeating disorders with addiction, because there's these parallels where,
Mhm.
you start seeking the reward despite negative consequences, and despite this lack of signaling in the brain, and sort of looking to get that signal again. Whether or not that's exactly why it happens is sort of a complex topic. It's really hard, especially
Mhm.
with humans, because we can't get into their brains like we can with rats and mice, right? We can't look as deeply at those molecular mechanisms and precise signaling mechanisms, but there seems to be a very, very similar sort of process between that and addiction to actual drugs that signal the reward system directly.
When it comes to setting goals, then for an individual who's looking to lose weight or build muscle or whatever it might be, how do you differentiate between like a well-structured goal and a poorly structured goal?
So it definitely depends on the individual. So something very interesting in the literature is that if you take someone who has a decent, let's say someone has a decent understanding of macros, they've done a diet or two before, they go to the gym, they eat fairly healthy, and they want to lose weight. For this person, making an extremely specific goal, time limited, exact weight changes per week is a great idea, and then following that plan. On the other hand, if you take someone who's never really done a diet, they don't really understand how macros work, this is all new to them. If you give them that precise plan, they're probably going to fall apart. So when someone is very new to a topic or an arena, having them work on doing more learning or process goals is a much better idea than having them do an outcome focused, very precise goal. So maybe instead of the exact weight loss, they would focus on learning 3 different strategies for meal prep and understanding macros and calories without even trying to lose weight at first. And the interesting thing is that person might actually end up losing more weight on that learning focus process without even a weight loss goal than they would if you gave them very precise weight loss goals, just because it's so overwhelming and so new that it becomes too challenging to be feasible.
Right, that makes sense. And I think most people who started a diet have experienced that, on some level. So personally, when you start working with a client, how do you determine their start point and the rate of progress that they're capable of and willing to make?
Yeah, I think something really important to do is, first of all, a sort of diet history with them. How much have you tried to lose weight? How have you tried to lose weight? What's your sort of background in your fitness journey? Just to determine, how specific can this person's goals be? Do we need them to do a little period of maintenance and learning first, or can they jump right into the diet? And then also another really important thing to assess, and I think people get so gung-ho and forget this so easily, is what's going on in your life. What's realistic for you? Even if you know everything there is to know about macros and nutrition, and you're going to start a diet, if you have 3 vacations, 2 work travel trips, and your sister's wedding coming up in the next 3 months, it's maybe not going to be a great time to start a diet, even if you have all the knowledge and tools to do it. So just assessing where they are in their fitness journey and where they are in their life right now, and what their obstacles are, like what trade-offs can they realistically make to get to their goal.
Yeah, that's something that I've had to talk a lot about with my athletes as well. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced the same thing where you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, well, I lost all this weight before when I did this diet and now I just can't seem to do it. And it's like,
Right.
okay, well, what's
What's
different?
different?
You know, like you were a kid and you didn't have any responsibilities, and now you're a mother of two, and
Right.
you're trying to get from a national level to an international level or whatever it
Right.
might be. And it's just like there's so much going on that's just different. Even right
It's
now, I'm
beautiful.
I'm very
Sorry, go
very
ahead.
lucky because I don't have a regular job. Like I literally go to
Right.
training, I come home, I eat, I sleep for a couple hours, I wake up, I eat, do some work, I eat, I nap again, and then I usually do more work, and then I go to bed, and then I do it all over
Right.
again. And so it's like
Yeah.
I have the opportunity to eat and sleep as much as I need to
Right.
recover from my training. Whereas the
Maximize
next guy,
everything.
yeah, it's like how many people have that? And it's like pretty much none, you
It's
know?
sort of like the life MRV concept. Like, what's
Yeah,
the
yeah, exactly.
recoverable volume of anything you can do in a day, right? You
Mhm.
can't just add things infinitely, no matter what sort of
Yeah.
different aspects of your life. They all take up your time.
Yeah, and it's really difficult sometimes to explain that to people because you'll have that conversation. They're like, "I know, but," and it's like, "No, there's no but. Like, it's just you have to accept the way it is."
But on
Um,
Instagram, they said if I just get up a little earlier, I'll be
yeah,
able to,
yeah,
right?
yeah. The reason why you're not 30 pounds lighter is because you don't wake up at 5 a.m. like the one percenters.
Right.
Um, so when you're working with clients, then it sounds like communication's a really big part of that process. So
Yeah, absolutely.
how important is social support then, whether it's a coach, whether it's family, a spouse?
Yeah, it's super, super important. And I really encourage, I've had many clients in the past who sort of didn't want to tell, their friends or family that they were dieting for whatever reason. Sometimes, lots of failed diets in the past, they feel embarrassed to tell people that they're trying again, or they just don't want to sort of be shamed for not eating and drinking and doing all the things that everyone else is doing. But it's incredibly helpful just to get the support of your friends and family, even if you have to have a private sit down where you're like, hey, this is important to me. Can you please support me in my goal? That usually convinces people to be supportive and be there for you. And it in the literature, having people around you who support you and give you positive feedback and congratulate you on your wins is really helpful in reaching any kind of goal.
Hmm. And so do you find that there's ever a kind of like some people obviously might like a little bit more of like constructive criticism, probably a little more criticism than construction, so than constructive, but then other people, like you were saying, need a lot more support. Like how do you differentiate between the two individuals that you're working with?
Yeah, so very often, at least in my experience, and this is a less data-based response and more just anecdotal experience-based response. In my experience, a lot of times when you get the people who start out and they're very happy in their lives already. This is just sort of a frosting on the cake thing, the weight loss. And they tend to be very optimistic and not super worried if one week doesn't go perfectly. Maybe they have a barbecue and that's more important to them, and they just sort of brush it off their shoulder when they don't lose as much that week and say, hey, it was worth it. Those kind of people, you can usually say, like, if you want to go faster, this is what you'll need to do. You can be a little more harsh and direct with them because they tend to just brush that off their shoulder too and just be optimistic and carry on. The people who are coming in and they're really stressed about the weight loss and they're really worried, a lot of times that overlaps with the same people who sort of need a little more hand-holding, a little more support, and positive affirmation that they're going the right direction and doing well.
Hmm.
But
And
again,
so,
that's my anecdotal experience, not necessarily science-based.
no, that makes sense. And so how much time do you usually, I guess, a lot for when you're looking at trying to change someone's behaviors, when you're looking at establishing new goals? Like how far out in advance are you planning for? And then also, how are you communicating that with your athlete, or not necessarily with the athletes, but with your clients? Like here's what you can expect. Here's roughly like how long it takes to do this, as
Yeah.
part of like a development
So
into your actual lifestyle.
yeah. In my experience, a lot of people who come in and I can tell they're, kind of new to dieting, they're not as familiar with all the concepts and they're struggling when they start the diet. it's very hard to convince someone who's just signed up and paid you for weight loss to not lose weight and to learn for a few months, you know? So often I'll use that first diet as a teaching opportunity. So 3 months of sort of teaching, and very often they don't lose very much weight, but at the end they still feel like they know a whole lot. And then they do, 3 months of maintenance. And then very often after that 6 months of sort of learning and understanding and getting their meal prep habits going and their favorite diet foods and all that stuff figured out, the end of the 6 months, the next cut is very often incredible. So anecdotally, it takes a sort of newer person to fitness about 6 months to get in the groove and really be effective. And I think the newer you are, the longer it might take.
Yeah, I've had a really similar experience with my clients as well. Like, I tend to try and focus on the same things, like behaviors, and try and prioritize those over sometimes your outcomes necessarily. So
Yeah.
I might say something like, "Hey, like let's track your adherence,
Mhm.
to these goals." And so let's say they have, I don't know, two goals that they're going to be working towards each week, or two behaviors. So one
Mhm.
behavior might be, eat X amount of veggies per day, go to the gym 3 to 4 times per week or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you can track
Yeah, that's great.
the first 2 weeks. It's like, okay, your adherence is at like 30%. But
Mhm.
then by the time week 3 and week 4 hit, their adherence is up to like maybe 50, 55%. And then it
Right.
keeps progressing. And I found too, especially with weight loss clients that might be a little bit more sensitive to that sort of thing, um, it takes their focus away from the outcome, away from the weight. And so it's a little less
Yeah,
personal,
that's really smart.
and it's a little bit more like actionable, because you
Yeah.
like you can't be like, okay, I'm gonna lose 20 pounds this week. It's just like,
Right.
that's not a behavior. That's not something you can control, right? Whereas,
Right.
if you have behaviors, it's like the behaviors will potentiate you reaching your goals, but
Exactly. Yeah.
having just like a
But they're much
goal.
easier to change and
Yeah,
observe the changes more quickly. Totally.
yeah,
I
exactly. And
think
I
that's
found
really
that to be,
important.
for sure, I found that to be really, really helpful for a lot of clients as well, because it just puts into perspective like how hard they're actually working. Like, I had one athlete not too long ago told me, he's like, "Hey, I want to be one of the strongest uh, men on the planet. Like, I want to deadlift over 800 pounds, and I want to do this." And I was like, "Okay, cool. Here's where your adherence is." And because we do track all these things, and it's like,
Right, right,
"And here's what you're saying you need to be." I was like, "I can tell you right now, there's not a chance in the world that you're ever going to get
right.
there behaving this way, and I think it's a really cool thing, because you can show someone that, and they're like, "Oh, either maybe I'm setting my goals, maybe my goals aren't actually my goals, or maybe I need to change something if I do want to reach them."
Yeah,
So
absolutely. It helps tie the outcome to the behavior too.
yeah,
So even though we all sort of know that logically, when you are trying to lose weight and you feel like you're trying, but you're not losing, and then you start tracking your adherence and you're like, oh, I was only 40% adherent. And then you get up to 70% adherent and you start seeing changes, and you get up to 90 and you see more changes, and you're like, oh, okay, there's a
yeah,
relationship here, direct relationship between how I behave and what outcome I get. And that's really, really helpful.
yeah, that's a really great point. And so, when, I guess, coming back to data tracking them, like, what kind of metrics are you keeping track of? And I know it's going to change from one athlete to another, but is there like a general, okay, these things are generally going to be pretty important for people wanting to lose weight. These things are going to be, important for people who are a little bit more type A. These are going to be for people who are a little bit more new. Anything like that?
Yeah, so very similar to you for particularly my newer clients. Some of the things I start with is, how many times a week did you eat veggies? How many meals, if they're really new, how many meals in the day did you have protein? And how many times did you make it to your planned exercise? Because those tend to be kind of sort of some fundamental aspects that build so much more quickly. Like if you try to tell someone like, how many times did you go over carbs? It's not as a fundamental a thing to go, plus or minus carbs. But if you're getting
Yeah.
protein and getting veggies, it's harder to overeat. Your muscles supported, and if you're getting to the gym, especially the new people are going to have those body comp changes. So those are three of the ones that I'm really big on for the newer people. For people who are a little more experienced and a little more refined, we do some sort of more precise things. How many meals this week were you on target for your macros? How many of your lifts were you on target for your volume and load increases and things like that?
coming back to environment and coming back to like goals, I know you mentioned in the seminar that I saw, you talked about specific timeframes for establishing goals, right? So people have 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 1-year plans,
Right.
6-month goals, things like that. Um, what are your recommendations on timelines as far as goals are concerned? And how could you utilize those timelines to kind of structure your environment, to kind of ramp up into it?
Mhm. Yeah, so I try to tell my clients that having the distal goals are great. I want to lose 100 pounds, or I want to do a fitness show, or whatever it is, these things that are over a year away. Those are great, but those are more of like a vision board. What you want to have are some proximal goals, or sort of shorter term goals that are small enough that you can not only sort of visualize that actual change, it doesn't seem so fantasy. And you can build a direct action plan to get from point A to point B. So having both are good, because the distal goals are inspiring and they're sort of help motivate you at certain times, but the proximal goals are probably even more important, because within those you can build your action plan and your behavior changes in order to work up to it. And I usually recommend for those to be 1 to 3 months long, to fit within the context of a sort of more fuzzy, broad 1-year plan. Um, it's obviously fine to have dreams outside of a year from now, but that tends to be harder to really implement. You don't know what you're going to be doing in 3.5 years, in April. So you can have those, but focus on the shorter term and within a year length for your planning and behavior change.
And so, how often do you find when someone sets a goal and they start working towards it, that they actually pivot from that initial goal?
Yeah, I think that happens a lot to people in fitness. I think there's a strong tendency, especially right now, with the availability of social media and looking at other people and what they're doing. And I think people forget to consider sort of the trade-offs and things that they'll have to make to get to that. They see, someone on Instagram looking awesome, and they're like, I want to do that. Well, you're going to have to train, 6 times a week and be dieting for 75% of the year to look like that and maintain it. Is that what you actually want? So when they sort of realize what it takes to get to a certain thing, a lot of people will say, you know what, I'm gonna readjust my priorities. I really enjoy doing these other things that would be precluded by that plan. And I think that's a really important part of goal setting, is to assess what you actually want for you within the context of what it will take to get there.
Hmm.
So I often have people will say, when they start a diet, they want to make max progress. Everyone does. What's the max weight I can lose? That's what I want to lose. And I usually say, you know what, let's do the first month on a moderate progress diet, and then we'll assess it a month. And I very rarely have had anyone at that month point say, like, let's take it up a notch. Almost always they're like, you know what, I'm pretty comfortable and I'm losing weight. Let's just keep doing this. So it's good to get in the trenches a little before you make a decision on your goals and understand what you'll have to give up.
Yeah, agreed. And that was definitely something that I used to do a lot when I first got into weightlifting. I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be the best in the world. No big deal. It'll probably take me like 3 years, I think. And like, I just had no concept of what that meant, and I had no concept of genetics or anything like that. And I think a lot of people really do that, and then kind of they shoot themselves in the foot, because, like you said, once you realize the magnitude of what you're actually after, it's just like, oh my God, like that's what
Yeah.
it's going to take. Like,
Yeah, this
whereas
will be
if,
your whole life sometimes.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Whereas what you're saying is a lot more moderate. It's a lot more like, hey, this is going to be really hard. Why don't we just start with this and see what happens? And then if we're getting good
You can
results, we
always
can
bite
stick with
off
that.
more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really smart approach, because, at least in my experience, I found that a lot of the times when I have people who come to me and they're really, really gung ho, I'd say more often than not, those are the people who go super hard right out of the gate and then also fizzle out really quickly.
Fizzle out. Yeah.
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 And
Motivation is great, but it's not really sustainable.
so why is
You
that?
don't stay motivated for a full 3-month diet, and generally so it's just sort of discipline and habits that take you the rest of the way when the motivation fades.
Hmm. So Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that's something that a lot of people, I think, want to know about is motivation and why that is the case, like why it does fade. But then some people say it's super important. Like you have Tony Robbins, who, awesome guy, love the stuff that he puts out sometimes, but then also I think maybe spins things a little bit, suggesting that you can do a dance or some sort of, ritual and then just inspire yourself and be super motivated at any given time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some people who are capable of that, but I would say that sounds like a lot more work than just building a bunch of habits that become automatic, that you just sort of switch on or turn up or dial down depending on what you're doing, right? So that sort of brings us to willpower too. So motivation, pretty fickle. It shows up when you're feeling good. Usually when you're not on a diet, when you're not training real hard, that motivation is really high. Deep into a diet, it dwindles quite a bit. Or when you're, in your peak week of a long lifting phase, your motivation is dwindling. But if you have really good habits and in your mind, you just don't miss a workout on peak week, then you do it anyway. You get up and you go to the gym and you're like, this sucks. And you go anyway, because that's your habit, right? So willpower is a sort of similar thing. There was a lot of literature for a long time suggesting that willpower was something that you trained and it was sort of a limited resource. But I think the most compelling literature right now suggests that willpower is more like an emotion. It sort of ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's strong, sometimes it's not. There's a lot of factors that influence it. So you can override all of those things with really good habits, right? If you don't have any motivation, you don't have any willpower, but you have a really ingrained habit to eat well and go to the gym, you're going to ride that a lot easier than trying to spark a new motivation or, rejuvenate your willpower on a really rough day.
Awesome. So it sounds like those are more so effective adjuncts that you can add to like a pre-existing set of behaviors from what you're saying. Is that
Absolutely,
right?
yeah. When you're motivated and you have willpower, it's great. It helps a lot. But having good habits to fall back on is a lot more reliable.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of factors or what sort of role does genetics play on things like willpower and maybe the degree of difficulty that someone's going to experience when they try to develop a new set of habits or maybe change existing behavior?
Yeah, it's hard to research something like that because there's so many, nature and nurture factors intertwined. It's hard to piece those out in humans. My guess would be that, like most things, there's a very strong genetic component. Some people are just going to be better at willpower. They're going to be better at staying positive and being motivated. But I'm also a big proponent of being able to change. And I think that practice, building habits, and getting yourself dedicated to that process can help you make up for what you're lacking in the genetics arena there. So I think that it does play a role. Some things are always easier for some people, but you can reframe things for yourself. You can start to change how you do things and be better at doing them, whatever that avenue is, whether it's building really good habits or being really good at remotivating yourself or framing things in a more positive, intrinsically driven way and stuff like that.
Coming back to what you said earlier in the episode about the intention-behaviour gap, how would you go about closing that gap and really making some fundamental changes?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely. So again, the intention behavior gap is when you're like, I really want to start working out at the gym 5 times a week, but you just don't do it. And you want to do it, you start doing it, you stop. And I think the most important way or the most effective way of bridging that gap is to build a habit. Get yourself set up, you can do things like, my plan is to go to the gym 5 days a week. If you go twice and you usually went 0, congratulate yourself and try to go 3 times the next week. Set your gym clothes up outside your door. It's an implementation intention. So the motivated you makes it easier for future less motivated you to do the thing, right? Like all your gym clothes are clean, they're in your bag, you got your shaker in there already. You get up in the morning, you're like, well, everything's ready. I don't have an excuse. I have to go to the gym. Writing little notes for yourself, like, if my work meeting goes late, I will go to the gym anyway. things like that, so that you plan for the obstacles and sort of tell your future self how you'll overcome them. That can be really helpful. Give yourself a reward after doing things that you want to do. You know, if I go to the gym, I get to watch, binge watch this show for an hour afterwards, something like that, while I eat my dinner. So just any way that you can sort of make it easier for yourself to do the thing and build a habit. The more often you actually go, the more easy it will be to go, because the more automatic it will be.
Mm-hmm. So how important is actually giving yourself those rewards? Because that's something that I found as well, both for myself and for my clients, where you kind of get into this mode where you believe that in order to reach something, you have to have this, pure ascetic lifestyle. You can never touch candy bars again. You'll never have cravings. And it's just not really the case. So how can you implement rewards? And also, if you could touch on, how people often incorporate things like cheat meals or cheat days, and
Mm-hmm.
what sort of benefit does that have? And what are some of the dangers of that as well? Sorry,
Yeah,
I know those
absolutely.
like 8 questions at
Yeah,
once.
no, that's good. I think I got them all. Catch me if I miss one. So rewarding yourself is just, there's a lot of different strategies for changing your behavior. Rewarding yourself is one thing you can do. And, you can change that reward depending on the person. Some people might be like, I'm going to eat my carbs as Fruit Loops after I lift. It's the same amount of carbs, but I really like Fruit Loops. So if I lift, I get those. Some people, it might be, a relaxation thing, like I get to watch a show, or I get to do something I usually feel guilty doing. But since I lifted, I won't feel guilty doing it. It can be something like you have an Excel spreadsheet, and for each day that you're supposed to lift, you put a little check mark on it. And that can be really satisfying to people to see that little check mark and see how many times they've done what they said they were going to do. That can be a very reinforcing reward. So you can get creative with what gets you going, what will make you feel rewarded and encouraged to do the behavior again. In terms of using food as a reward, I would usually discourage that. I think you can use, like I said, I'll eat my carbs as this thing that would usually make me feel kind of bad as a reward. But if you're just saying like, I get to, binge on pizza if I do this, not always good just for keeping away from food dysfunction, but it depends on the individual as well. In terms of cheat meals in general, I think that's also super individual. Some people can do a diet, have, halfway through, have a cheat meal, and they feel great. It reinvigorates them psychologically. It motivates them to continue the diet. It's a really small setback in the grand scheme of things, and it can work out really well. Other people, they have that one cheat meal and it sends them in, just down a spiral, and they can't stop, because those really, really tasty foods tend to initiate new cravings. And if you're someone who caves to cravings more easily than others, then it might end up being a bigger problem than a help to you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think one of the things here is that all this stuff is super individual, and it definitely depends on the person's psychology and, what gets them.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the second camp where I find I have to stay away from that food, or else I just end up going a little overboard. But
Yeah.
if I'm dieting, I'm usually fine. I don't usually have any cravings. But if I do go out and I do have something like a pizza or pasta or whatever, then yeah, it's this weird cascade of just terrible behaviors that I've developed
Yeah.
over time. It's
I
like,
would rather
well,
just all
yeah.
or nothing.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like, well, I had a slice of pizza, so I may as well eat an entire tub of ice cream and 5 chocolate.
Right, yeah.
Because it's pretty much over for me.
Yeah, and there's definitely some literature for that, eating tastier foods makes you want more tastier foods. That's definitely something that's been observed in science. But there's also people for whom the cheat meal really does help them, gives them a little break, and they just carry on just fine from there. So there's data is general. Data is based on averages, and there are people who are outliers, so you really have to take that into account as well. There's also people who think they're outliers and aren't. So another thing to consider when working with clients. No, I can have a cheat meal, I'll be fine, and then they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, I find most people think they're outliers.
Yeah.
Like, I'm unique, trust me.
Was it Mike and James, professor in grad school? I think it was him that said, "You're special just like everyone else."
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome. So looking at things like self-determination theory,
Mhm.
how does that affect someone's behavior and someone's, I guess, awareness around kind of what it is that they need to do and how they can actually go about executing on those behaviors?
Yeah, so a lot of, I just read a funny article. Hold on, I want to pull up the name for you too, because I think it just will apply really well. Just, oh yeah. So it's from a behavior conference, a psychology and behavior conference, and it's called "All Models Are Wrong, but Some Are Useful." So that is to say that all of the ways that we try to systematize behavior change are wrong, but each one can have a useful aspect. And the whole transcript of the meeting goes on to sort of say, like, yeah, we can divide these different behaviors, these different means of changing behavior, and try to systematize it and build these models, these wheels and these charts and these flow charts and things. But there's so much variability and so many different ways that individual variables affect best practice and best choice that we kind of need to use those just as very loose roadmaps and not necessarily anything to stick to completely. I think sort of related to your question, something that I found super interesting that seems to be really important. We've all heard of like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you hear a lot about how intrinsic motivation is more important, and it absolutely does seem to be stronger, but extrinsic motivation is also very effective in some circumstances and very ineffective in other circumstances. So that's just sort of an example of how these models and these ideas can be so different in different contexts. Sorry, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. Did that come close to answering your question, or at least addressing it?
No, it did. And I guess just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying about intrinsic versus extrinsic. So I literally am just finishing up writing a paper right now that does go in, relative amount of depth on those things as well. And so there's two different types of extrinsic motivation, and like essentially one would be something that is more akin to like controlled autonomy, or sorry, where, or sorry, controlled motivation, not controlled autonomy, where, maybe you're trying to get good grades because your parents are forcing you. So that's an extrinsic motivation where it's like negative, or it could be negative because maybe you have resentment and it's just probably not going to lead to the best outcomes, versus having an extrinsic motivational factor like I want to get good grades because it's going to, potentially set me up for a good career and things like that. And that ends up kind of becoming intrinsic because you sort of like take it on as your own. But yeah,
I think you can do that reframing very often with people. Like they say, I want to look good for this reason. You're like, okay, how can you frame that in the context of your personal values? So then you have sort of both motivators working together, which is ideal.
Totally. And a lot of the times that does happen with fitness. Like, honestly, I started fighting and lifting weights because I got beat up one time and I was like, I'm going to get this dude. And I mean, here I am like 8 years
obviously that's not
lifting weights.
Continuing to be your motivator.
yeah. I'm still waiting. I'm not quite there yet. I'm going to try and set up a fight. And I mean, at some point things just kind of shift and it does just become this really intrinsically satisfying process. That's really enjoyable. What did you say a moment ago, though? You said something about values?
Yeah, so sort of something I encourage clients to do is to tie, if their motivator is more extrinsic, like can you tie that extrinsic motivator to your values? Like say, I am working really hard to get a promotion at my job, right? The extrinsic value is, or the extrinsic thing is that they want to make more money and have a higher status at their job. But then you can say, why don't we reframe that? Like, I admire people who work hard and achieve a lot in their careers, and I want to be one of those people. So that's why I'm pushing for this promotion, just to give them an intrinsic framing to go along with their extrinsic reward.
I know that there's a lot of people who talk a lot about affirmations and they post these really inspiring, motivational quotes and things like that. Are you familiar with any of the research on like positive affirmations and self-efficacy and things like that?
Yeah, so the self-efficacy stuff is kind of interesting. It's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. there is a very strong correlation between self-efficacy and success in any given endeavor, but whether or not success causes self-efficacy or self-efficacy causes success, or both, I would tend to believe both, is sort of unclear. Like the directionality and the causality are not totally clear, but they are very strongly associated. In terms of positive affirmations, I think there's quite a bit of literature to suggest that at the very least, avoiding negative affirmations is really important. And you would, venture to guess then that positive affirmations are helpful. So I think this is something I talked about actually in Calgary, saying things like, oh, I'm so fat, or I'm this, or I am that, and sort of framing yourself, putting yourself in a box, more or less, can be really damaging. And I think there was a guy actually at that Calgary seminar who had a great story that fit into this perfectly. And he said, he was like the big buff guy, the other big buff guy. There are several.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think so.
Andrew Coates, yeah.
He said, no, not him. It was a third big buff guy. It was a big buff guy seminar, basically. He said when he was a kid, he was really chubby. And in his teenage years, he used to tell people like, oh, I'm the happy fat guy. And he's like, now that I'm not overweight and I'm like really jacked and lean, he's like, I realized looking back, saying I was the happy fat guy prevented me from changing, because then I'd have to admit to all of the people that I told I was the happy fat guy that I was actually the unhappy fat guy. And I'd have to live with the fact that I was lying to them to sort of cover for the fact that I wanted to change and didn't feel I could. So I just thought that was a great example of how framing yourself can trap you.
Yeah, I remember that, but I don't remember. I do remember someone saying that, but I don't remember who it was. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. I'm terrible for that. Like I call myself fat all the time. Like, oh yeah, I'm not a very good power lifter. Like I'm fat. Blah, blah. And someone was like, oh, when will you be happy with your physique? And I'm like, when I look like Simian Panda. And for any of you guys who don't know, Simian Panda is a natural, and I'm putting that in parentheses.
Yeah.
Seriously doubt it. Bodybuilding athlete or physique athlete who's like 4% year round and has like one of the most ridiculous physiques I've ever seen in my life.
He definitely has genetics and probably some other things on his side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we're actually kind of coming up to that 50-minute mark. I know you mentioned that you did have a couple of time constraints, so I want to be respectful of your time. Just have one last question, and essentially that's, what's one opinion you have that sort of goes against grain or maybe is a little bit controversial?
That's a good question. Let me think. I probably have a few. Maybe not all of them should be spoken about on the podcast. I think for me, this might be controversial, it might not be, but I think that the divide in the fitness industry right now that I don't think is a divide. So there's sort of the one side that is anti-diet culture, thinks everything about diet and fitness is wrong, and health, you can be healthy at every size, versus the side that says, like, oh no, there's a certain weight where you're definitely not healthy, and being fit is the most important thing, and if you choose to eat terribly and be overweight, you're wrong. I think that divide is wrong. I think I have a very libertarian perspective on the fitness industry, and I think that if you want to make certain trade-offs, whatever they are, for your happiness in your life, they shouldn't be judged. And I think it's perfectly fine to diet or not diet. And I just don't think that divide or that argument should even exist, because people should have the liberty to choose to either hurt themselves in the weight room or in sport, or hurt themselves by eating delicious foods for their life. We all hurt ourselves in certain ways for the things that we love and want to do. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that argument makes any sense. There shouldn't be two sides.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I'd say that for the most part, I'd probably agree with that, because a lot of the times, like when you pit these two arguments against each other, it's like, well, those are the arguments, and it kind of prevents, it ends up just being a straw man. It's like, well, those aren't the only two options.
Right. And you can do a little of each. You can diet for a while, and then you can eat whatever you want for a while and forget about diet culture and physique There's no reason that you have to pick a camp.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So where can people find you?
Mainly on Instagram. My account is Regressive Underload. I also am on RP, Renaissance Periodization's website. I have some books there. The Habit book will be coming out there, and I'll be pumping that on Instagram. If you're interested in reading it, you can find out information on where to pick it up there.
Yeah, I'll definitely be checking that out. So that's all going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. So you can definitely go check her out, give her a follow on Instagram. She puts out lots of really, really great content all the time. Mel, thanks so much for jumping on. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've been busy, and it's been a really great chat. Guys, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode and took a lot from it that you can apply to your own situation to see much better results. I just have one quick personal favor to ask of you. Please make sure you subscribe and leave me a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you're using. When you do this, it helps me get better at producing content and increases my exposure so I can continue putting out high quality information for you guys. Next, I want to extend a personal invitation to shoot me a DM on Instagram at Stacked Strength. I'll help you troubleshoot anything you need. This is literally an invitation to connect with me directly, so make sure you head on over and jump into my DMs. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.